Hey guys, tonight we begin with something oddly soothing, mysteries, or more precisely, the enigmatic rituals and forgotten lore of the ancient Druids, which turn out to be far more whimsical and shadowy than most of us could dream up. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, perhaps put on some gentle white noise, and let's drift into tonight's tale together. Before Stonehenge was a selfie spot and Celtic knots were tattoo trends, the ancient Druids navigated their misty world with a tapestry of secrets that would puzzle today's rational minds. It was called sacred guardianship, a daily rhythm woven with omens and charms, split as neatly as the seasons turned during solstice. The routine was straightforward. Upon waking, most Druids whispered invocations to the spirits, invoking protection against the unseen forces that lurked in ancient groves. Then, throughout the day, they'd pause for what can only be described as mystical safeguards. This wasn't seen as paranoia, it was just how life flowed. The watchful hours between tasks were viewed as essential, practical, and sometimes delightfully communal. People used this time to consult standing stones, sprinkle protective herbs, or check their torques, because nothing disrupts your day like wondering if a forest spirit is eyeing your path. And yes, this was also prime time for tribal rituals. Celtic healers and lore keepers noted that the mind was clear and attuned during these moments, which sounds like a subtle way of saying too relaxed to question the gods. So, if you ever thought you were thoughtful for avoiding Friday the 13th, just know your ancestors were setting the bar with mistletoe and sacred oaks. The evening would follow this interlude, winding down until starlight. Everyone from chieftains to farmers embraced this mystical cadence. Even epic tales like those in the Mabinogion casually referenced it, which means that yes, even in ancient scrolls, people were noting the importance of warding off otherworldly mischief. Curiously, modern anthropology suggests these secrets might align with natural human instincts for pattern seeking. The ritual cycle matches how our brains process uncertainty without modern science. So, the next time you touch wood at midnight, don't fret. Just murmur, "Ah yes, the ward has begun," and go polish a symbolic rune. It wasn't until later eras, with Roman conquests, Christian lamps, and the rise of skepticism, that humans began to enforce the idea of logic over lore, as though beliefs were a timed debate. In the ancient Celtic world, encountering an omen midday wasn't a flaw, it was the norm, and everyone followed it whether they understood it or not. Let's talk about dwellings, or rather the Druidic version of them. In our era, we fuss over smart homes, ergonomic furniture, and ambient lighting. In ancient Britain and Gaul, a home was often a roundhouse of wattle and daub, stuffed with charms that once warded off fae, now faded under the mists of time and unspoken fears. The typical tribal abode featured rush floors, known as sleeping platforms. This was literally rushes or heather bundled into a low frame if they had the means for one. If not, it was just mats on the earth, possibly damp, possibly shared with a sacred animal. These platforms weren't luxurious, but they beat the alternative of fairy-ringed meadows. Rushes were abundant, insulating, and good at absorbing bog moisture. They were also prime spots for hiding protective talismans, ogham sticks, and the occasional wandering beetle, which turned resting into a lesson in cautious repose. If it rustled, you ignored it. If it pinched, you shifted gently and hoped for divine favor. If a family had more resources, or at least a sturdy thatch, they might elevate the mat onto a wooden base. This didn't transform the experience much, but it did lower the odds of waking to a sprite in your sandal slightly. Woolens were a common comfort. Most slept in light tunics worn all day. Nightgowns weren't invented, and neither was solitude. Entire families, kids, parents, perhaps an elder, all slumbered together in the same room, sometimes on the same mat pile. If you overheated, you could always nudge into your sibling's space. Nobles, naturally, had grander setups, elaborate beds with headrests, woven blankets, and hides to block drafts and hopefully evil eyes. These beds were so prized they were buried with owners. You didn't inherit gold, you inherited Aunt Bronwyn's curiously carved wooden rest. Still, for most Celts, a home wasn't for ease. It was a fortress against the otherworld, to evade floods, and maybe, just maybe, to envision being wise enough to sleep without whispering wards against the god of mischief. When we say lucky charm today, we think of a cereal or a four-leaf clover keychain, maybe something whimsical with a grin and a questionable backstory. But in ancient Druidry, a charm wasn't trivial. It was a talisman, a tangible, often elaborate piece of stone or bronze meant to shield your spirit from wandering in the afterlife while you navigated daily perils. You see, protection wasn't the forte of Celtic architecture. Wattle walls, thatched roofs, and doorways of hide didn't stand much against tempests, and divine favor, that was called a raven. So, to guard their essence, especially since spirits escaped quickest through dreams, Druids embraced the humble talisman. These charms varied in forms and sizes, but the iconic Triscale was spiral-shaped, symbolizing the cycles like the god Cernunnos. They were typically crafted from amber, jet, or whatever shard of magic could be spared without offending the forest gods. For men, it was a vital tool. For women, it often doubled as jewelry, which also served to uphold modesty and conceal hair that hadn't seen a ritual bath since the last Beltane. But beyond safeguarding, talismans carried cultural heft. In some groves, the torque was expected on everyone at all times, yes, even in repose. And the piece could be inscribed or colored to show a clan's status or piety, because nothing declares prosperity like retiring with a mini deity on your chest. In tribal hubs, the talisman even signified being at ease. If you greeted someone wearing one visibly, it was a polite Celtic nod of, "I'm protected from the seed," and yes, this bauble implies peace. Of course, talismans were paired with cloaks, essentially loose garments. Picture a Druid's bard, minus the dramatic quest. Attire wasn't ornate, but it was functional, woolen, and occasionally blessed. Today, sharing a meal with strangers is mostly for conferences, awkward dates, or that rare hostile mishap. But in ancient Celtic lands, this was utterly routine and far from elective. Let's say you're a traveling bard, a pilgrim, or just someone whose chariot stalled halfway to Avalon. You seek a hall, a modest roundhouse at best, and request lodging. What you receive isn't privacy, or a cot, or even a swept floor. What you get is a spot on a mat already occupied. Celtic halls functioned like communal havens rather than solitary retreats. Seclusion wasn't anticipated. If the mat had room, you shared it, often with utter unknowns who might whisper dreams, invoke spirits, or harbor mysterious runes. This wasn't impolite, it was resourceful. Mats could accommodate 2, 3, even 4 wayfarers based on size and tolerance. In larger settlements, you might land in a hill fort space with rows of mats and zero boundaries. Invocation contests went unspoken. Elbow claims were subtly negotiated. Sometimes genders separated, but not invariably. Some trades grouped by trade. Bards with bards, warriors with warriors, merchants with fellow hagglers, allegedly. But frequently it was first arrived, first sprawled. And while this might horrify modern isolationists, then it trumped sleeping under stars with wolves, floods, or occasional fey raids. Concerned about theft, many travelers slept with pouches tied to belts or hidden in folds. Others rested atop bundles, making luggage both cushion and sentinel. If someone shifted your sack, it often meant awakening lighter. The elite, of course, avoided this. Chieftains journeyed with attendants and camped luxuriously, or demanded sole spaces if the host valued their favor. In the Celtic realm, retiring wasn't merely drawing a hide and fading, it was a divine endeavor, a knightly wager where the prize was your eternal tuath.
People didn't just rest, they readied for potential judgment, hence the ubiquity of evening invocations. Forget aromatherapy or soothing apps. Celtic sleepers unwound with offerings, chants, and soul-purifying hymns just in case they crossed to Anwen between dusk and dawn. The notion was plain. You could depart at any instant from ailment, curse, deities, or most perilously being past 30 in the Iron Age. So you'd better intone your rites, not for solace, but because the underworld was daunting and you didn't want to arrive unprepared, unanointed, and spiritually unkempt.
One prevalent verse, "If I should pass before dawn, I beseech the Morrigan my spirit to claim." Charming, yes, except it's essentially a child's plea acknowledging demise as a likely nocturnal event. Many adults possessed a repertoire of chants for varied threats, one for guilt, one for suspecting the Ios Sea in the shadows, one for plague aversion, which, sadly, proved ineffective. Some even beseeched specific deities famed for guarding dreamers, like celestial wardens at the soul's gate. The truly pious Druids, Ovates, and anxious kings concluded days with Vespers, the final rite before silence. After Vespers, they observed quietude, which wasn't challenging, as all were fatigued, undernourished, and mildly wary of night. Children, too, were urged to chant, partly for their essence, partly to occupy them beyond querying why the raven was on their mat again. Parents noted that gods watched, which seems endearing until realizing it's less protector and more divine oversight. In essence, pre-sleep rites were less about tranquility and more about 11th hour safeguarding. View it as ancient warding spells. You trusted they functioned, even if the mechanics eluded you. In contemporary times, visions are often brushed off as subconscious gibberish, anxiety, excess mead, or your mind sorting chaos in obscurity. But in ancient Celtic lands, dreams were regarded gravely, as in otherworld implications grave. Dreams weren't mere dreams. They were deemed missives from gods, ancestors, the She, your Anum, or possibly that odd standing stone you touched last solstice. Some were prophetic revelations, others infernal lures. Regardless, you were expected to heed and perhaps record or confess or purify for days to be secure. Druids, bards, and self-styled seers devoted surprising time to deciphering dreams. Whole Ogham inscriptions were devoted to interpretations. Dreamed of fire? Might be chaos. Water? Renewal or inundation. Dreamed of a stag-headed harp player? Summon a grove expert promptly and perhaps relocate. Celts held that what transpired in dreams counted because your spirit roamed while you slumbered. This implied dream deeds could expose concealed transgressions or spiritual flaws. That awkward dream about pilfering mead? Perhaps your inner self admitting worldly greed or just famine. But confess anyway, to err safe. Grove folk often noted dreams and shared with superiors. Some were lauded for sacred visions in sleep. Others advised to avoid mushrooms pre-bed. Naturally, dreams weren't solely mystical enigmas. They fueled narratives too. Celtic lore brims with dream sequences where heroes meet deities, demons, or allegorical beasts reciting wisdom. Dreams were essentially the bardic epic, but with more symbolism and fewer resolutions. The groves, predictably, were cautious. Not all dreams were holy, and some were thought sown by chaos gods to corrupt the pure. If you envisioned something impure, it meant your essence was besieged, or you dozed too near fairy rings again. In today's world, some let pets in bed. It's snug, if sometimes odorous. In ancient Celtic tribes, sharing with animals wasn't quirky, it was a spiritual tactic. Let's begin with fundamentals. Celtic homes weren't comfort-built. Wattle and daub, no seals, drafts fierce as moor winds. Sacred warmth? That was the family hound. In humble roundhouses, humans and beasts often cohabited the same space, sometimes the same mat, and frequently the same heather bundle.
Geese roamed, dogs nestled at feet, ravens perched by the hearth, and if fortunate, none scratched during night. This wasn't affection, though Celts revered animals. It was harmony. Beasts embodied gods, ravens the Morrigan, dogs Cu Chulain's kin. They were divine, reliable, and unlike kin didn't claim the best spot. A hound could ward spirits. A stag in the corner might elevate sanctity by a notch, which in storm season felt miraculous. Celtic homes, especially modest ones, often had one room for all: cooking, dining, resting, occasionally rites. Kids might nestle between parents and a sacred boar. A goose could alarm at dawn. Hygiene? Best not probe. For affluent families, this lessened. Chieftains didn't typically slumber near livestock, though they might have favored hounds abed, not for divinity, but for prestige and pest control. Some groves had separate quarters for holy animals, because nothing says authority like a raven with its own perch and title. Drawbacks existed, of course. Beasts can be noisy, they wander, and historically, they're not famed for boundaries, but Celts adapted. A beak poke at midnight? Just bedtime norm. If you've shared a feast hall and thought this is excessive, meet the ancient Druidic Grove Dormitory, where Ease went to meditate under vows of eternity. Groves shunned personal space, or luxury, or frivolity really. The standard dormitory housed dozens of initiates in one vast clearing, arranged neatly like devout sentinels. Beds, if termed so, were earthen slabs, sometimes with heather mats if the archdruid felt benevolent, or it was a holy day. You slept cloaked, not for decorum, but because dressing in dark for dawn rites was more arduous than bedding prepared. The Druidic garb, including robe, belt, and sandals, served as spiritual shield and meager warmth. If chilled, you layered. If warm, well, no, you endured. No cushions, no dividers, and no chatter. Silence was mandated, not optional, under Dagda's rule. If you shifted and sighed too audibly, you might draw purification duty for a week. Cawing ravens, however, were tolerated. You couldn't control them, but if disruptive, the gods might note, or at least your brethren would. Illumination was sparse. One torch, perhaps. You didn't need sight, you needed stillness and purity. That was the aim. Despite austerity, Druids believed sparse beds prepared for eternity. Denying flesh honed the soul. Rest wasn't delight, it was duty, scheduled like offerings. Some Druids even slumbered upright to shun indulgence or visions or ease. Compared to this, tribal heather piles and cawing ravens seem opulent. At least the raven didn't judge. Let's discuss something that would appall modern resters: rising willingly at midnight, not for relief or scroll, but for ritual. Chanting, chilled, firelit ritual. In Celtic groves, this was standard. Druids followed strict schedules based on lunar hours, including dawn service, and by dawn we mean deepest night, when even stars pondered awakening. The horn would sound, often blown by the unlucky, and the clearing of cloaked, rest-deprived souls would file to the sacred oak in hush, and yes, still garbed, because Druids shunned nightwear. The only system they trusted was divine. In the grove, by flickering fire, amid tree echoes, they'd chant hymns, offer mistletoe, and strive not to doze standing, which was genuine concern. Legends show Druids disciplined for nodding mid-rite, usually with extra duties or chants. Dozed in dawn rite, now lead the next. Services could span hours, zealous orders extended to 3. Imagine maintaining devotion while your belly recalls dinner was porridge and a lesson, and your form fades. After, Druids might return for second rest, or in strict groves proceed to study or labor, because nothing declares piety like scribing Ogum on fragmented repose. Why so early? To dedicate night's purest part to gods, undisturbed by daylight's lures, mist, or cycles. It symbolized devotion, or at least once you overcame numb toes, smoke, and the off-key hymn from Brother Lou. In our time, resting solo is often luxury, signifying independence, peace, or blanket control. In ancient Celtic tribes, solo slumber was dubious, impractical, or outright hazardous. Let's start with basics. Warmth. Homes, as noted, weren't toasty. Wattle walls and open vents trapped little heat, and sacred fire was centuries off. So people shared mats for essence heat, not closeness, but basic thermal need. Children with kin, parents, sometimes the visitor's child if present. It resembled a gathering, but uninvited. But beyond warmth, there was mystical motive for group rest. Many believed night was when the other world stirred. Alone in dark, your anum might be vulnerable to temptation or worse, unrest. Others nearby formed a moral shield. If amiss, at least witnesses or first to thwart the entity. For young, solo night was inconceivable, not just comfort, but because spirits, deities, and wandering essences filled nocturnal tales. Stories warned against lone rest as a portal to mischief and peril, and unlike modern tales, these ended in vanishings. Even couples often shared with offspring, servants, or guests. Privacy was a myth. In fact, two alone on a vast mat would seem wasteful or profoundly suspect. In grove contexts, initiates slumbered communally. Solo assignment was often penalty. Yes, sometimes lone mat was literal chastisement. Celtic logic, solitary grants sin chance. Group, accountability. Next time you're alone in bed with your blanket in a room sans beast scent, savor quiet.
In Celtic lands, you'd likely have 2 kids, a sacred raven, and a cousin, all cawing. If you've napped upright in a meeting, cart, or waiting hall, you likely awoke with neckache and regret. But in ancient Druidry, upright rest wasn't mishap, it was choice. Some Celts, especially elite or devout, opted propped over flat. Why? Reasons, none restful. First, belief lying flat harmed digestion, breath, or life force balance. In a world where healers thought a cough could displace your anum, this seemed sound. Upright aided avoiding brain congestion, ominous but meaning don't choke on humors. Second, spiritual worries. Flat mimicked death pose. You avoided confusing gods or attracting the Kailich by resting funeral style. Superstitious? Utterly. But when your druid was also healer, you chose battles wisely. Thus, people often rested reclined, bolstered by pillows, headrests, or carved supports like Celtic easy chairs. Chieftains had beds with angled props for semi-seated, ideal for processing evening ale or repelling surprise entities. Druids advanced it. In strict orders, they might sit on benches or lean trees with naught but hoods for comfort. It wasn't health, it was piety. Too comfy? Might dream. Dream? Might err. Err? Welcome to dawn confession. Needless, this wasn't quality rest. It was virtue, unease, and puzzling theology. Forget spectral visions or entities under mat. For Celts, true night terrors were already in fabrics, small, tenacious, and indifferent to chance. We're speaking, of course, about midges, lice, and the Celtic bedroom's emblem, the moor flea. Let's not gloss. Hygiene wasn't Celtic's forte. Baths were ritual, laundry rare, and soap from ashes better unnamed. Add heather mats, shared woolens, and occasional holy bird, and you've pest paradise. Fleas and lice were ubiquitous as roommates. Tribes battled daily. Chieftains, despite furs and canopies, weren't immune. Some households had dedicated groomers, servants removing nits from masters' cloaks and garb. Imagine that title, Keeper of the Royal Mane.
Moor fleas were silent stalkers. They hid in bed frames, mat seams, even wall cracks, emerging nocturnal to feast like tiny demons. If wondered why Celts wore headrests and full attire abed, it wasn't always warmth, sometimes pest armor. Remedies ranged effective to wild. Some burned herbs like sage or yarrow to repel. Others slept with garlic, onions, or ashes abed, which might do little for pests but curbed intimacy. It wasn't mere itch. Pests symbolized impurity or divine disfavor, biting reminders of chaos and poor choices. Poems existed on midges, some moral, some oddly poetic, as nothing says devotion like "unite us as the flea that plagues us both." So while modern rest disrupts by alerts and lights, Celtic was likely interrupted by scratching, twitching, and subtle shin crawl, because it was. We've had sleepless nights, but ever tried dozing in 50 pounds of wool? No? Well, in ancient Celtic tribes, some did precisely that, because nothing says serene dreams like being ready for ritual at rest. Now, clarify, most, even Druids, didn't routinely sleep in full regalia. It was hot, heavy, and cumbersome. Turning in layers like trying nap in a bramble bush. But during festivals or in sacred sites, sleeping partially adorned was safer. Comfort optional, piety recommended. A night in a grove might remove only hood and jewels, keeping robe or tunic on, lest gods call midnight. Nothing like awaking to lunar hymns and needing attire while half dreaming of spirals. In sacred precincts, attendants might sleep with staves or symbols aside, like fervent security talismans. Talismans doubled pillows, and if alarms sounded, at least no dressing. Priorities. Of course, full garb wasn't restorative. Wool isn't breathable, and beads pinch. Add earthen floors, minimal padding, and ambient chants and fires, and you've rest environment ranking below moor on comfort. Even non-ritual folk sometimes wore light protective items in uncertain areas. Traveling bards or warriors might doze in anointed cloths, offering slight safeguard and more padding than prayer alone. And garb wasn't subtle. Shift wrong, you might rustle so loud, all awoke assuming the wild hunt arrived. In a time when nightly entities, pest swarms, and ravens abed weren't odd, you might think somnambulism was mere quirk, but no, it was dramatic. In Celtic lands, if you wandered asleep, people didn't attribute to fatigue or moon. They assumed possession, curse, or unfinished rite with the pantheon. Sleepwalking, or nocturnal wandering, if impressing the bard, was misunderstood and feared. Idea someone could rise from mat, shuffle room, stare at a tree, was less harmless and more otherworld rehearsal. Accounts suggest genuine spook from sleepwalkers. Imagine a figure in a cloak, torch in hand, eyes vacant, muttering ogham unknown while stepping over beasts. You'd think apparition or heretic or both. And per local druid, exorcism might schedule pre-dawn. Some believed caused by imbalanced life force, especially excess bile, Celtic's catch-all for inexplicables. Others thought Anam temporarily freed, leaving the body to amble like unattended hound. To prevent, they tried herbs to chants, hanging charms, or rurally tying leg to post. Extreme? Consider homes had open hearths, blades everywhere, and pots waiting overturn. In a curious note, rumors of hill climbing asleep. Whether exaggerated, fear of leaping dreamers led to latticed doors, and debates if one could sin unconscious. Thankfully, most just paced, muttered, or tried imaginary gates, But if sleep walked to grove, locals might see divine sign or call cleansing to cover bases. If Celtic life taught anything, it was resting through tumult. Grove horns, storms, bleating beasts, occasional raid.
For the mist-shrouded weary, these were ambient, Celtic white noise. Start with horns. Grove signals marked sacred moments, dawn, rites, meals, and midnight vigils at 2 or 3 a.m. If near grove, dreams soundtracked by blasts. Brain adapted, horns became lullaby for overscheduled soul. Not just horns, storms frequent, terrifying. No forecasts or sealed doors, every thunder like world end. Roofs leaked, lattices rattled, winds howled like banshees. Still, people rested. They must. Labor didn't pause for wakefulness, nor did farming, chanting, or evading Romans. Speaking which, invasions and cataclysms weren't always rest breakers. In eras, people slumbered through famine, war, even plagues. When chariots rolled morn, it was grim alarm over panic. And if not awake, some saw mercy. Legends show resting through quakes, fires, and mobs. Deprivation common, bodies adjusted. If toil dawned to dusk, ate barely, spent days dodging mist, taxes, divine wrath, you'd crash hard. Then some used rest as escape. Faced illness, loss, or world end, forecast often. Some curled under cloak, murmured right, napped. Strange wisdom there. In the mists of 52 BCE, the lands of Gaul were wrapped in more than just chill. They were enveloped in resistance, routine, and a subtle unease that seeped into the hill forts and sacred groves. The people of Gaul were Celts, fierce, devout, and deeply tied to their forested soil. They believed they were thriving in a tribal alliance, watched by gods and favored by trade. Life was vibrant. The tribes had rebounded from earlier skirmishes. Markets thrived with iron, mead, and torques. Warriors trained in the fields. Groves to Cernunnos in Epona stood proud. Add to this the harsh Gallic winter, and something was bound to erupt. That eruption came from Julius Caesar, long thought ambitious. Minor clashes had shaken the tribes for years, but locals dismissed them as normal. Rivers froze, animals grew restless, but daily life continued. Smiths forged blades, merchants haggled, children played in clearings. On a fateful day in 52 BCE, the uprising roared to life. A massive alliance under Vercingetorix rose against Rome. For the Celts, it was the beginning of the end. Battles rained down, blanketing fields and choking air. Some fled immediately, grabbing weapons and heading to the hills. Others sheltered in forts, hoping it would pass. By the siege of Alesia, the tribes were buried under Roman legions. The defeat would soon seal their fate. Gaul was a vast tribal land of millions, a mix of warriors, druids, and farmers. What was about to happen would preserve their lore in Roman accounts, a snapshot of Celtic resistance frozen forever. What began as rumbles in the tribes would soon become screams in the dark and a legacy of defiance that still captivates the world. Once the uprising awoke, its fury spread like wildfire, silent at first, then devastating everything. The initial phase was skirmishes, light clashes for months. Forts groaned under siege. People huddled in halls, covering mouths with cloaks. They lit fires against the unnatural cold, praying to tribal gods. The first victims were those caught in ambushes, trampled in panic or slain by swords, but soon the horror escalated. At Alesia, the Roman circumvallation hit, starving everything in weeks. Despair reached boiling point. Bodies wasted, spirits broke in the encirclement. And that's our journey through the enigmatic world of the ancient Druids tonight. If this whispered tale of secrets and forgotten history resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and drop your thoughts below. Until next time, may your nights be warded and your dreams prophetic. Good night.